like to welcome you all. Okay, recording, thank you. Welcome to the Social Sciences Week event, Youth and Experiences of Debt. This is from the Newcastle Youth Studies Network we're presenting, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this online event from the lands of the Dark and Young people where I live and work. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us online today. So I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across New South Wales and Australia. So the seminar that we're presenting today presents preliminary findings from a research program that we're conducting at the University of Newcastle. Regional Youth in Precarious Times, Work, Wellbeing and Debt is the full project title. And the full research team includes your speakers today, David Farrugia, Julia Cook, Kate, Davies, Steve Threadgold, as well as Kate Senior, myself, Barrie, Shannon and Adriana, Haro. So the program broadly explores the relationship between work, wellbeing and debt for young people living in precarious social and economic times in Newcastle and the Hunter. Economic precarity has led to a steady increase in rates of problem debt among young people in this region. And the presentations in the seminar today are going to present findings on the apps and spaces used by short-term debt services, and from interviews and participatory research with young people about their experiences of debt. So presenters will have 15 minutes each. I've asked them to keep their own time. I'll give a 1-minute warning and we'll have questions at the end. So please post questions you have in the chat and I'll draw from those to base questions for the discussion that we have at the end. So the presentations we have today are Buy Now, Pay Later, Financial Products, a New Generation of Consumer Credit, presented by Julia Cook and Kate Davies. Then the Gamification of Debt, presented by Steve Threadgold. And then finally, Indebtedness, Youth and Adulthood, Morality, Affect and Time, Reshaping Youth and Adulthood, presented by David Farrugia. So thank you. I'll ask Julia and Kate to start us off.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julia. I will just, here we go. And can I have a thumbs up? Can everyone see my screen? Brilliant. So thank you everyone so much for coming along today. It's fantastic to see so many people coming and interested in our research. Brilliant time to be speaking and thinking about social science. So Kate and I are going to be speaking today a bit about buy now, pay later financial products and services, and I'll explain a little bit why those are of interest to us. So I'm going to start off, then I'll throw to Kate for a bit, and then I'll finish off at the end, and I promise we'll keep 15 minutes. So to start off with, what are buy now, pay later products and services? Some of you might be familiar with them, some of you maybe not. Afterpay is probably the best example, but basically buy now, pay later services and products are a way of buying a product and then paying for it in installments. So usually it would be paying in 4 equal installments over each 2 weeks apart, and they're generally mediated by either apps or a kind of web-based platform. And so buy now, pay later providers are not necessarily new. They were even around in some form in the 2000s, but they've really exploded in popularity in the 2010s, especially the latter part of the 2010s. So taking some data from ASIC, we can see that buy now, pay later transactions have increased enormously, even 90% in the financial years from 2017 to 18 and 2018 to 19, and they've only kind of increased from there. And so in terms of why they're of interest to us as a group of youth sociologists, they're of interest to us predominantly because of their large kind of usership of young adults. So again, this is data from 2018, so it's changed a little bit, but even at that time, 60% of buy now, pay later users that were surveyed by ASIC were aged between 18 and 34, so a very young user base. The user base also skews slightly towards females, and the kind of things that people are buying are generally consumer products, things like clothing, technology, electronics, software. So not really rent and food. It's not really a product that's intended for what you need. It's intended more for what you want. There are also, interestingly, specific buy now, pay later services for things like cosmetic procedures and tattoos that have popped up. So, and a really crucial point around how people interact with this and how interacting with buy now, pay later services might influence people's behavior is that almost 2/3 of the people that were surveyed said that using buy now, pay later services allowed them to spend more than they otherwise would. So generally, I think that's kind of interesting in terms of what they mean. So the study that Kate and I are presenting today, which was part of our wider research program, was a kind of study that took place in 3 parts. So first we conducted a policy analysis to see how are these products and services regulated, and then we moved on to look at what are these kind of products and services, what is their digital presence. We looked at them on their websites, we looked at the apps, we looked at how they functioned, how they presented themselves, and then finally we were interested in kind of tracking them through physical space. And so we did a walking ethnography of a big department store and homemaker centre here in Newcastle, which was quite a lot of fun, but Kate will tell you a bit more about that. So to start off with the policy analysis, which I'm going to touch on really briefly today, because it's not really our main focus, a lot of the kind of discourse around buy now, pay later services is that they are unregulated in Australia, and that's not exactly true. It's more accurate to say that they are not regulated as a form of consumer credit. They are regulated as a financial service, and they're covered by the regulations that cover the broader financial services industry, but they do not have regulations that are specific to them, and they are not regulated as consumer credit. And the kind of regulation policy landscape is really fast moving at present in relation to buy now, pay later services. Some of the highlights are expanded powers that ASIC will have over buy now, pay later products from next month, and the buy now, pay later industry's current attempt at self-regulation, which is quite interesting through their voluntary code of practice, and the degree to which that is genuine and the degree to which it will influence the kind of industry's behaviour is yet to be seen, and definitely an interesting space to watch. So I will now throw over to Kate to talk a bit about our analysis of the digital space and our walking ethnography.
So as Julia said, we in the first part of this component of our work, we looked at buy now, pay later products in digital spaces. So we looked at 11 different products, and there are many. For 8 of those, we looked at websites and apps, and then there were 3 of those products that were website only. As we worked through those, we pulled together details about the images, text, interactivity, and the overall design. And we saw some concepts repeated throughout the products, and they really emphasised the ease of use, accessibility, flexibility, and this kind of magic of buy now, pay later by letting people live the lives that they want. So we broke this down into 4 key themes, and we saw that each of the products really tapped into identity. They're not just about the things that you might want to buy, but who you are, who you want to be, and how you want to be seen. So next slide, Julia. So the first category and theme that came out strongly for us was around aspiration. So the products being sold to people in terms of aspirational identity. So it's this aspiration to be one of the beautiful people You can see in the example here from Afterpay that they're playing off this idea that your personal fashion purchases equate to high runway fashion at Australian Fashion Week. The images in these aspirational products tended to be of younger people, predominantly female, always conventionally good looking. And in this aspirational space, buy now, pay later is positioned as a means to live the life you aspire to. And one of the notable quotes was, buy the things you love to empower the life you want. That language around empowerment does make me vomit a little bit, but you know. Next slide, Julia. So the next category, kind of in contrast to that, was around relatability. Tapping into those people who might not think of themselves in relation to Fashion Week. So these are the kinds of people who might hang out on the couch. You don't even need to be good looking to use these products. There's a buy now, pay later product for everyone. So some of these categories focused on things around the home, things like pets, home renovations, and really being in your own space. Next one. A number of the products drew on models that were already familiar through other types of social media. So in particular, the kinds of setups that we might see on something like Pinterest, they emphasised personalisation and offered inspiration via mood boards and wish lists. So, you know, buy now, pay later can turn wishes into reality. That's its magic. They're not just a way to pay, they're a way to choose what to buy, to help you to get to know yourself. And, you know, pretty clever targeted marketing disguised as being a good deed for customers. Next one. So the last category here was around gamification of payment methods. So there isn't much that these kind of tools do that's different to what you might get from online banking, but they make it feel like a game. So they give the user a sense of control and offer rewards and positive reinforcement. Like, congratulations, you've been approved. There's a sense that the product's doing something for you, that it's in fact helping you manage your finances. And images such as the cute bundle bear that you can see on the screen there are innocuous. They're fun characters to take you through the game of buy now, pay later. Next one.
I'm sorry, my computer has frozen.
That's all right. I'm just going to keep talking anyway. So understanding buy now, pay later products is important because it's about understanding how and why people engage with credit and debt in a landscape which there's really not much research evidence about yet. So how and why people access particular types of credit, it means something. In Australia, there's evidence that many groups of people, and particularly young people, are unlikely to access credit via banks. Credit card use has declined as buy now, pay later uses increased. And we saw in some of our previous research around small amount credit contracts or payday loans that people tended to use those types of credit because they felt like they were designed for them. They were accessible. People didn't feel judged. And we see similar themes playing out in buy now, pay later. So the next part of our study was looking at buy now, pay later products in physical spaces. And this is where we visited 215 shops across a large shopping centre and also a homemaker's precinct. And we took notes on if any products were advertised in store and the type of signage and placement. And some interesting patterns stood out to us here. The buy now, pay later products were ubiquitous. They were everywhere and they were like this gateway drug to credit, you know, like it's all right, everyone's doing it, it's okay, we're not dealers, we're your friends, you know, really enticing in a gentle way. They were completely normalised. So they were just another way to pay, and in fact they were more fun and flexible than other ways, and never any mention of credit and certainly not of debt. It's like, you know, move along, nothing to see here, just pay and go on your way. Next slide. So there were some categories where there was more signage. Sportswear shops particularly had a number of different products displayed really prominently throughout stores. Some of the categories that were more discreet with their signage, or where there was no buy now, pay later products advertised, were expensive clothing stores targeting older women. And we hypothesised that might tell us a couple of things, that buy now, pay later is targeting younger people who might not have means to pay for the goods they want, or who might not access other forms of credit, but also that there's a type of elitism going on, that if you're in this store, we expect that you can pay for what you're purchasing. And there's really this emphasis on normalising the products again. It's worth noting, the next slide, Julia. It's worth noting that buy now, pay later companies aren't just marketing themselves to consumers. They're also, they're really targeting retailers. So in general, the way that they work is that it's the merchant who pays the surcharge for a customer's use of buy now, pay later. So the buy now, pay later companies have been quite clever in creating demand for the products at both ends. Demand from the consumers who want accessible, easy, non-stigmatised forms of credit, and demand from the retailers who want and need the business of those customers.
Great. And I'll take over again now. Thank you so much, Kate. And so I'm just going to finish off by linking what we've kind of shown you today to the concept of the new adulthood, a new experience of young adulthood. And one of the things that that I kind of got to thinking about buy now, pay later products and the young people using them was, what relationship do these products and services have with this new experience of adulthood that's kind of characterized by what has been referred to as delayed transitions, although that type of language has its issues. And the kind of main kind of relating ideas that we came up with were that buy now, pay later products can offer independence in the face of prolonged dependence on family, especially for those who are co-residing with family members. There's a certain kind of privacy offered by buy now, pay later services because they can be accessed digitally. You don't need to physically walk into a bank. They also provide access to fun, frivolity, and aspects of youth culture, a way to engage in elements of material culture that might otherwise be difficult for those who aren't necessarily earning a large amount of disposable income. And then finally, they provide, related to that, a means of attaining consumer goods for individuals, young people who are spending increasingly long periods of time in education and in insecure work, episodic work, and low paid work. So there's a clear kind of reason why these particular products and services are potentially targeting young adults as their one of their really key markets. So I'll skip over this for now because I think we're just about out of time, but we would love to answer any questions that you have. So please do pop them in the chat, and thank you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks everyone, and apologies for my 90s grunge style guitar feedback in the background.
Thanks, Kate and Julia. Steve's up next.
Hi, I'm just trying to share my screen. Is that working?
Can't see it yet, Steve.
So it's saying my screen sharing is paused, sorry. that working?
Yes.
Sorry.
All good.
Okay, so I'm going to just kind of continue on from what the first presentation was about, and talking through the interviews that we've done with young people about these issues. So the program started off thinking about young people and debt generally, and recruitment has been interesting in the sense that we've really been struggling to find young men at all to talk about debt, and much of the debt that the young people were talking about was through the buy now, pay later kind of services. So that's what we'll just kind of continue to focus on here for now. So one of the things we're finding is that debt is kind of ubiquitous for young people, but they kind of have different categories of debt. And these relate to different forms of morals that and time that Dave will talk about in the third presentation. And good and bad debts relate to what the debt is for. So good debts are things like a mortgage. That's almost like an aspirational debt. HECS and study related debts are seen as good debts because they're like an investment into the future. Bad debts are more kind of short-term, consumer-based kind of debts, around Afterpay, about buying stuff for like clothing and games and stuff like that. Interesting, so far cars seem to be somewhere in the middle. They're both like a good debt in some ways because they're about transport for work and leading a life in places like Newcastle where public transport sucks so bad, they're actually quite important. But on the other hand, they're seen sometimes as a dodgy debt, they can break down, they depreciate. So our participants have, what I think are fairly sensible orientations towards debts in many ways. And largely these are kind of relate to things like responsibility and necessity. So in terms of this kind of short-term debt, they did mostly talk about buy now, pay later products. And again, as the quotes here kind of point out, there's kind of a kind of moral relation to those kind of debts as being irresponsible, it's frivolous, offering short-term instant gratification. These are not good things to get into debt for, according to some of our respondents. So as you see, SM says here, I don't really want to engage in things like Afterpay. It's not necessary. I don't need them. Like I want a Nintendo Switch, so I'm just going to pay for it and Afterpay. This kind of stuff is seen as being kind of irresponsible. So there is that kind of, in some ways, moralized orientation towards this kind of consumer spending. But more generally, I would say that our respondents have a fairly ambivalent relationship to these kind of debts. There's also a real distinction made between banks and credit cards and things like Afterpay. So you would approach a bank for bigger, more important, almost kind of good kinds of debts, things that are kind of more needs, and Afterpay for those kind of little everyday wants. So again, that moral thing in terms of good and bad debts relates to categories of needs and wants as well, which again, I think is kind of fairly common sense. So there's some negative attitudes towards Afterpay, and there's a realization that you can get into a bit of trouble by using them. And we have some participants that have some examples of that, but overall, they're almost seen as a bit of a necessity. What we're finding really interesting in this data, though, is the way that these different forms of debt make our young people in our cohort feel. And I think part of me is quite worried about our research in a way, is almost we're providing proof of concept for these buy now, pay later services, because many of our young people talk about their orientation towards those things as being much more positive. They make them young people feel kind of more accepting or more kind of happy with engaging with those things rather than with banks. So you can see here, for instance, there's an effective economy that relates to the moral economy. And this is really important because the way that people feel about these things will obviously have real effects on the way they engage with them. And whether they see them as things that will want to use more or less or whatever. So when it comes to banks, for instance, some of our respondents saw them as being solid, as being having tradition, of kind of being trustworthy because they were so kind of institutional and been around for a long time. But most of the time, that was kind of a more, most of our respondents were more likely to talk about them in banks and credit cards in negative terms. So there's real kind of distinctions here in terms of the attitudes towards these things, and they're around emotions. They're kind of an effective economy that's going on here. And you can see this in terms of relating to what Julia and Kate were talking about in terms of the marketing. Our young people spoke about how they like the way that they're marketed these things towards them. This kind of idea that, oh, you just pay this kind of stuff off in 4 quick things, then we'll send the stuff out. When it comes to banks, you know, like not being able to pay off a debt, there's quite a common expression of banks being there may blow up your life. They'll send around the debt collectors, and you're going to be sad if you get into debt with banks, where doesn't seem to be as like emotionally taxing as it would be with something like the buy now, pay later stuff. So again, there's kind of different attitudes towards this kind of thing. But importantly, and again, touching on some of the stuff that Julia and Kate have already outlined for us, the buy now, pay later services employ what I'm calling the gamification of debt. So they employ lots of things and tactics and kind of methods, I suppose, from, you know, various forms of platform capitalism like Spotify and Pinterest and stuff like that. And even kind of almost like poker machine kind of technology to try and keep people on the platforms for longer. And these things have a kind of effect on the way the young people are oriented towards them. They become more kind of socio-cultural platforms than economic in a way when they're kind of consumed like this. So these things include like storified on this day kind of reminders of purchases you once made, anniversary pop-ups, waiting time indicators, and symbolic rewards. So these things employ what's called gamification, and the idea of gamification here is, you know, bringing aspects and mechanics associated with games into kind of non-game environments. And this is to increase participation. There's an element of kind of what's the kind of nudge economics going on here too. So these are very deliberate strategies by these platforms. And I've been delving into some of the literature that, you know, almost the instruction manual gamification literature here. It's very deliberate. And it's very deliberately trying to effectively modulate people's behavior by offering them rewards and stuff like that. But remember, the rewards here aren't mandatory. They're, you know, dings and things like that happen in the app. Now, importantly, our young people I don't think are duped by this. They reflexively understand that, you know, these are in some ways forms of entrapment and manipulation. That they're there to encourage them to use the things more. But they also then see the benefits for using these services in their day-to-day lives. So they acknowledge both the negative possibilities and the kind of affordances to be able to buy stuff as well. So in terms of what some of our participants say, this is a response from a focus group. You know, rewards being offered that delay repayments. What these kind of rewards do in something like these buy now, pay later services is they kind of level up. Like if you're successful at a particular level in a game, you can move up to the next level where you can put off the first repayment now to the week after. So as this respondent says, got this thing the other day saying that my first payment is actually going to come out after 2 weeks now. I've been rewarded for paying everything off early. I didn't even know this was a thing. I've always had the payment straight away. It's some reward system. Now I don't have to pay my first payment up front, but here you can see the kind of reflexive understanding of what's going on here. Yeah, it's like delaying it. It's not an issue now, but it's going to be in a couple of weeks' time. Similarly, when talking about her experience with the Nimble app, which isn't buy now, pay later, it's more of a payday loan scheme. LF here talks about how the waiting time is like a similar experience about waiting for a pizza on the pizza app, on the Domino's app. So the Nimble app, it's more or less the same as a Domino's app. Like when you apply for money, it's like she's referring to the symbols on the app here. This is where the application's at. It's like being reviewed. It's there. This is many hours until it will be processed. You can track it at any point. The Nimble app is so similar to ordering a Domino's pizza. It's actually quite terrifying when you think about it. So this ease of access to debt is quite terrifying in many ways, but it's, for many of our respondents, it's better than going into kind of the more complicated world of banks and credit cards. So as LF continues to talk about here, whereas credit card through banking app, it's nothing like that. It's probably why it daunts the fucking hell out of me, because I can't understand it talking about credit cards. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know when the payments are due. The bank sends me letters, and even opening the mail terrifies me. Nothing good comes via snail mail. I think that's a really kind of important distinction that's what's going on here between the platforms. I don't think I've ever in my adult life received anything good via the post, like standard mail, other than shopping, which kind of rings true, I suppose. I've never received anything positive. The last thing I received in the mail was a red light camera ticket. That's not positive. So I think that's why credit cards are so daunting. Like, I have no idea where it's at. So when snail mail equals bad news, banks and credit cards feel less friendly and feel as if it's harder to strategize your way once out of that kind of debt situation. Now, it's important here, I don't want to make any comments on the accuracy of that. It's not actually that important, right? Whether it's easier to pay off debts with credit cards or Afterpay or whatever. It's just in terms of what we're interested in here is the orientation of our people, young people, towards these things. And that's what they're saying. They feel this is the case. So this automated direct debit nature of repaying the nimble loan increases the certainty for some of our respondents and helps them to strategize their way out of the debt. And a lot of them talk about this kind of idea of a game plan. I don't know how to make a game plan. I try and combat the debt when it comes to credit cards, particularly the way they communicate with them. At least with this nimble loan, I know exactly when it's going to come out. So they know when, where, how much. It feels positive. It's not daunting. It's informative. It's instantaneous. And like, I think that's a good quote here to keep in mind for what Dave talks about in his presentation. The second the money comes out, I get a thank you email and a notification on the app. Sounds really nice. It's like you have many payments left, this many payments left, how much you paid, etc. I don't have any of that with my credit card. I just get like no caller ID calls to be like, you've missed a payment. I'm like, I didn't even know I had a payment. I feel like there's no set schedule to it. So again, the snail mail, the no caller ID here, these things feel threatening. So to conclude, just kind of summing up some of the things we're looking at here. The online and automated design of these products, I think, feel more friendly, feel nicer because they relate much more closely to how young people engage with information in their day-to-day life. Much more lives online, received online, things like, physical mail, actual phone calls, are things that in day-to-day life are largely rejected anyway. So why would you want to get those things from a bank or a credit card? So this digitalized kind of engagement with the forms of debt, it's just more relatable in that sense, as Julia and Kate were talking about earlier on. They would rather deal with an app and rather than dealing with actual people. That's because, actual people are hell and all that kind of stuff, and institutions are hard to deal with, but also the app itself allows you to kind of engage without feeling the shame and guilt of being in debt, I suppose, which happens when you have to actually deal with people themselves. The actual gamification literature here, the kind of instruction manuals and the academic literature about to try and make this stuff better and make it more efficient in our day lives actually talks about how what needs to happen in these spaces is to transform our kind of notion of human capital from Homo economicus, which if anyone knows my work, I've been endlessly kind of criticizing, to the idea of Homo ludens, the idea that kind of moved from this rational decision-making machine of Homo economicus to this kind of more gamified subject. And again, nudge economics here as the kind of orientation towards this. But importantly here, again, anyone familiar with my work would expect me to say this, would be that I don't think that young people are being duped here. And as you can see in the responses that I've presented here today, that they're pretty reflexive about what's going on here. They understand the good and bad parts of debt. They have definitions of what are good and bad debts. But in reality, for most young people, debt is just a necessity in the kind of day-to-day lives where, HECS debts and study and is ever more expensive, highly uncertain labour markets, casualisation and stuff like that, just to kind of have a day-to-day life where you can actually engage with the things that are seen to be good, you need to incur some of these kinds of debt. So debt here is rendered as inevitable occurrence that needs to be negotiated and strategized for having an acceptable life in the present, but also to be able to plan for the future towards kind of various perceptions of a good life. And we've been playing a little bit around now with a kind of theoretical idea around this, and I'm influenced particularly by Sian the Guy about this and notions of ugly feelings. And this idea of a kind of effective state of what we're currently calling independing, kind of a play here on the notions of dependence. Everyday life in the future is dependent upon relations to debt. That means the future itself is always pending and reliant upon those relations and whether you can pay it off or not. And this kind of then has some connotations, I suppose, to the very notions of independence and adulthood, kind of I think that which are concepts in youth studies that constantly need to be renegotiated. Okay, I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Dave.
Hello friends. Okay, so I will be talking about the role of credit and debt technologies in the distinction between youth and adulthood, focusing in particular on the themes of morality, affect, and temporality. Looking at the way that the moralities and affects enacted in different forms of credit and debt shape and produce the temporalities of youth and adulthood. The key backdrop to all of this is, of course, that young people in contemporary, what's been called financialized capitalism, are encouraged to understand themselves in financial terms. They're encouraged to understand themselves as investors or as speculators. They're encouraged also, and indeed very often mandated, to go into debt in order to invest in their future. So young people are encouraged nowadays to understand adulthood as something that requires investment and something that requires work on the self in order to increase the self's value. So they are encouraged to invest in the value of themselves and to see themselves as assets, and to anticipate returns on a whole series of investments in the self, most notably education, as the return on these investments as a key part of what it means to become an adult. So notions of investment, speculation, and those kinds of financial rationalities are in fact now critical to what it means to becoming an adult and critical to the distinction between youth and adulthood. At the same time, as Julia has pointed out, young people are also at the center of a poorly understood crisis of consumer credit. So on the one hand, young people are encouraged to do things like take out large HEX loans in order to, engage with the labor market, whilst at the other hand, they are the targets of these new technologies that encourage new forms of indebtedness and consumption. So debt, investment, and speculation are now critical to what it means to be young and critical to what it means to move towards adulthood. And I'm going to look at this in this paper from the perspective of three aspects of debt: time, morality, and affect. So basically, all forms of credit and debt enact temporalities. They rely on and produce different relationships to the future. So for instance, mortgages are based on an imagined biographical temporality in which income steadily rises, whereas a payday loan is a short-term thing used for dealing with immediate crises. So the key thing here is that different forms of lending enact time. They produce different forms of time in people's lives. So that's number one. Number two, there are also complex moral obligations attached to indebtedness. Debt operates as a moral obligation to pay and always has. David Graeber's outstanding history of debt shows this. So the thing is, though, that indebted subjects are morally obliged to pay. However, creditors are also regarded as morally suspect. So the creditor that lends in a predatory manner is an important figure historically. We've recently had the Banking Royal Commission. So there is a complex set of moral obligations and moral attributions that happen on the side of creditors and debtors. And finally, a lot of the literature on debt and the issues as well that Steve raised also emphasizes that repayment is a reflection of an effective investment or an effective entanglement with debt. So the moral obligation to pay at a particular time is something that needs to be felt and is reflected in experiences like shame or anxiety. So shame and anxiety are key to certain forms of moralized indebtedness, but also the financial advice literature describes feeling good as a reflection of sound investment. So Martin in 2002 has looked at financial advice volumes that say, look, if you feel good, if you can sleep well, you're investing well. So what I'm going to do in this paper is to look at the temporalities, affects, and moralities that are enacted in different uses of credit and debt by young people, and look at both affect and also in the kind of object-oriented tradition, to look at credit and debt as socio-technical devices that produce specific specific forms of calculation, or what's been called qualculation, which is the attribution of qualitative or quantitative value in order to arrive at an imagined future outcome. So affects, embodied and attachments to debt will be looked at in terms of as things that are enacted by the technologies themselves, be it HEX or be it, buy now, pay later loans. And we can look at that in terms of the distinction between youth and adulthood. So the first key thing that comes out in our data, Steve talked about the way that young people regard certain forms of debt as good and certain forms of debt as bad. The basic thing with the distinction between good and bad debt is that good debt conforms to the logic of investment and an investment in a future adulthood. So here's a young person that says large debts like mortgages and HEX debts, in a sense that's useful debt. It makes sense. It gets you further by going into debt because there's an equity in what you're doing. Right. And the equity, they go on to say, can be, things like, you can get a return in terms of your job, making money in the future as a result of your HEX debt. A mortgage gets you a house. You can sell the house if need be. So it's not buying something that loses value. So investment accumulates value. And in that sense, it's seen as good debt. For instance, HEX is an investment in the self, in the cultivation of the value of the self. So in fact, young people, when they talked about that debt, HEX debt wasn't really seen as being like in debt. It was seen as an investment. So investment is necessary and prudent. It's a prudent and self-responsible investment in the young self and in the self's movement towards adulthood, and it realizes a return. So the equity of this investment is the value of the self that is seen to increase over biographical time, over the distinction between youth and adulthood. Now, the thing is that the nature of the labor market basically makes this a mode of speculation, because as we know, young people's pathways through work are not very certain. However, this logic of investment and speculation is how young people are encouraged to, and I think they're taking up that incitement to become adults. And this is a key backdrop for understanding things like credit cards and buy now, pay later schemes. Because buy now, pay later schemes do not market themselves as facilitating investment. And it's really key that this self-responsible investment has become part of how young people understand the movement to adulthood. So as Steve said, banks are regarded as scary institutions, and this has moral overtones as well. So banks offer good debt because they offer mortgages, which is seen as an investment, but they are also regarded as morally suspect because they can be predatory. So credit cards are regarded as something that, banks trick you into getting a credit card, then you rack up heaps of debt. That's bad. We've recently had the Banking Royal Commission, which has kind of, made the notion of predatory lending a big thing in the Australian public sphere. So banks are regarded with suspicion, with moral suspicion, right? That a bank can sometimes lend to you, but if you get in trouble with that bank, that can be the bank's fault. And that's really critical for the experience of different kinds of debt, especially Afterpay. So Afterpay, at the moment that it's used, is not experienced as going into debt. There is a kind of abstract recognition that you need to repay it, but it's not experienced as debt in the same way. So here's a participant that says credit cards, the way they're structured is really predatory. But then I started thinking about Afterpay and ZipPay. They're different because it's not associated with any banks or loans or finances. I thought that was a safer way to engage with getting a loan because it doesn't even feel like you're technically getting a loan. So Afterpay doesn't feel like going into debt. Even though they know in an abstract sense that it is a loan, it doesn't come from a bank. And so the affect of Afterpay, the feeling of it is not that of being indebted, which is not a nice feeling. Also, Afterpay is marketed as being for pleasurable consumption. Because of this, and because of the way that Afterpay operates at the moment of consumption, Afterpay feels like money, not like debt. It feels like your own money. You're spending your own money. As Julia said earlier, Afterpay markets itself as a way to pay and not as debt. So here's a participant saying, it feels like less of a big deal. Afterpay and things in general compared to anything to do with the bank, I had to pay a late fee to my bank and it feels bigger and realer, more professional. Whereas compared to Afterpay, which is like, oh, that's a bit cheeky, $10, I'll just send that in right now. So Afterpay makes it feel like it's small and it makes it feel like it's your money and it's just for fun compared to banks. I think that's really key that, and then they say this is with banks, it feels like this is how debt happens. So that's not how Afterpay feels. It's really key that Afterpay is seen not as debt, but as money. Because what young people do, what this shows, is that that something becomes becomes debt and experienced as debt when it's qualified as such, like when it's attributed with that meaning by the person using it. And that doesn't necessarily happen at the moment purchase with Afterpay. Another thing is that Afterpay is marketed as at young people, as we've heard. So here's a participant saying Afterpay and ZipPay and others, that's a really young people thing, 18 to 30 or so. It's very much marketed at those sorts of people. So it seems more appealing. Afterpay seems more appealing than credit cards and stuff. So buy now, pay later services are marketed as facilitating fun, youthful, enjoyable, unserious consumption without immediate surveillance. No one's looking over your shoulder. The bank's not there. Your parents aren't there. So narratives about using buy now, pay later services were about seeing something desirable and then buying it and enjoying it in the moment, with the knowledge that the immediate cost would only be a quarter of the item's purchase price. So then what happens, of course, is that you get these modes of calculation in which the necessity to repay is pushed into the future and eventually confronted. And it's at the moment that it's confronted, like in the future, that it becomes debt and it feels like debt. So here's one participant saying, in my head, I used to think it would be like, oh, well, that's a fortnight issue. I'll just worry about that later on. If I've got, say, 100 in my everyday account and this thing I wanted to buy was 25 bucks, I'd be like, oh, it's only 25 bucks. I wouldn't think, oh, it's 25 times 4. I would think, oh, it's only 25 because I wasn't paying up front. Whereas now I think I have like 150 bucks on my Afterpay. And I'm aware, oh, in 2 weeks, I have to pay this in 2 weeks. I'm more aware of it now, whereas 2 years ago, I would think, oh, it's only $25. So this is a mode of calculation that is produced by the technology of debt, and that is also facilitated by the gamified nature of debt, as discussed by Steve. So here's another person that's saying, I wouldn't say it felt at the time like I was wasting my money, because I always wanted it, always wanted the thing, of course. But I don't know, because it was such a bad habit too, because I just transfer out of my savings. It didn't feel like there was an issue at all. I would just think, oh, it's all right. I'll transfer 100 out of my savings that I'm not meant to touch. There was no discipline. There was nothing. It was just like, oh, it's fine. I've got money in other accounts I'll use. It only really struck me when I would open the Afterpay app and see in like the right-hand corner what you spent. And it was like $2,000 or something. And I'd be like, oh, yuck. And actually that yuck is the moment at which an Afterpay obligation becomes debt. So that yuck is an effective reflection of the requalification of Afterpay as indebtedness. And at the moment that it is requalified as debt, the modes of calculation, affectivities, and moral obligations of being an Afterpay change. The key thing is that participants kind of recognize the contradictions about this. They recognize the kind of different imperatives, and they felt, annoyed that, on the one hand, they're encouraged to buy things, and on the other hand, they're made to feel ashamed. So here's a participant that said, we can shop, we can get the things that we want, that brings us happiness. At the same time, we're shamed for it. I feel bad about it because I won't have as much money in my next pay, and then they talk about not feeling like they can talk about being in a lot of Afterpay debt because it's moralized and it's seen as shameful. So in the process of repayment, young people experience a sense of moral failure at having lived beyond their means at that moment, not when they get into debt. The thing is with Afterpay that this takes place in the absence of an obvious creditor, such as a financial institution, which you can make claims of and that you can attribute moral judgments towards. So this is a kind of contradiction. On the one hand, there's no moral obligation to a creditor, but on the other, the moral obligation of a creditor to a debtor is also absent. And what that means is that whilst creditors are sometimes understood as having a moral obligation not to lend, or to lend on fair and sustainable terms,
but this is
the experience of indebtedness can include feelings of injustice when you're in debt to a bank. But with buy now, pay later services, you don't feel like you're in debt to a bank. So you have failed yourself. And so the experience, the moral experience of debt is about having failed to satisfy, about having failed to properly regulate the self's desire to consume, a personal failure to limit one's own consumption rather than implicated with the normal moral distinctions of debt that you have when you're in debt to a bank. So buy now, pay later debts are deeply intimate and experienced not as a relationship to a potentially predatory creditor, but in terms of a moral failure to discipline the self. And this is despite the gamified nature of debt, which encourages young people to consume and which they are aware of. The key thing as well is that Afterpay debts are not investments in your adulthood or in anything. And so because of this, they are moralized in ways that are completely different to investments. So here's a participant that basically says, if I work hard and I buy something with my money, I feel like I deserve deserve that. But if you use Afterpay, do you really deserve what you've bought? You don't have the money to buy it, you just want it now. Also, they go on to say, this is going to have long-term effects on my generation because you can't afterpay a house. What are you going to do then? So the relationship between the temporalities and moralities of consumer credit were explicitly opposed to the self-responsible investment required of young people in the biographical movement from youth to adulthood. The right way to consume is deferred gratification, which reflects your capacity to engage with a properly financialized adulthood, represented by your capacity to get a mortgage and things like that. So Afterpay is a failure of self-responsible adulthood. Also, being in tons of debt makes it harder to become an adult because you can't buy things. And this is basically what this person here is saying. I'm in too much debt, so I can't do the normal adult things. So it can become more than a moral failing and can materially interfere in people's capacity to achieve the milestones of adulthood. So to sum up, what does this mean? There's been suggestions recently that with the expansion of financial technologies into everyday life, what we're getting is a new set of signals as to how life is to be lived and what it is for, in which financial logics become part of our aspirations and definitions of a good life. And I think financialization and the imbrication of credit and debt technologies with young people's everyday lives has produced competing and contradictory temporalities of youth and adulthood, which are part of the affects and moralities enacted in these debt technologies. So on the one hand, young people are expected to invest in themselves as subjects of equity. On the other hand, they're the key targets of these expanding consumer credit technologies, and these contradictory affects and moralities are produced in their lives because of the different, forms of credited debt that have become part of their everyday life. So calculation, investment, and speculation are now part of the biographical shift from youth to adulthood and part of the everyday consumption practices that consumer credit offers. And so I think what our program has kind of tried to do, just to finish, is to show that a focus on youth sheds light on the relationship between affect and morality in the use of consumer credit by showing how modes of calculation enacted in different credit technologies relate to the changing temporalities of the life course. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks to everyone for all the presenters. Obviously, the papers really spoke to each other, and thanks for all of the questions and conversations in the chat. I think we've already sort of started discussion. So yeah, if there's any last questions, please ask them, but I thought I might just pick up on the first question that Akane asked about stigmatization, because that can obviously be threaded throughout the papers. So yeah, I just wondered if any of the presenters would like to comment on that. Maybe, I don't know who could go first. I'll let you decide. Any of you could.
Well, I think basically the stigmatization issue kind of relates to the moralization of debt, as I kind of discussed. So debt is stigmatizing when it's a failure to do something responsibly and well. And debt has often been seen as stigmatizing. But I think the thing with debt is that debt is it's not just that debtors are stigmatized. Debt is a scene of moral contestations. And those contestations take a really particular form when the whole thing is just a gamified app that's marketed to you as a fun little thing that you can do on the weekend. It's very different when you have a bank, which is something that you can contest. You can say the bank did this, but with buy now, pay later, I did this.
Yeah, and that's why the effective economies discussion that Steve introduced in particular, and that you talked about as well, Joe and Kate, is so important. I think the understanding the feelings associated with the different forms of debt and then the way that it's turned back on the self is such a crucial dimension of the way that the gamification works.
When we were doing research on payday loans, one of the other interesting things was that people were saying they make an intentional choice to access something like a payday loan because they don't want to take loans from families because of the complicated relationship stuff there, and what that means. So people wanted something that is kind of a bit more clear cut, that they have a professional relationship with.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of most notable things to me that we found in this research program is just that the choice of certain sources of credit and certain types of loans and such is not necessarily a calculation of which one offers the most advantageous terms. It really seems to be which one feels the most kind of okay and which one fits best with the type of expense. So any kind of arguments that could be made around, like, we need better financial literacy education, like, yes, that may be the case, but that's not really the start and end of these things, because ultimately our participants generally did understand the terms of the things they were signing up to, and did understand in some ways that, like, yes, this may offer less advantageous terms than doing this other, going into this other form of debt, but this one felt manageable and felt better.
Any other questions?
Sorry, maybe just as a follow-up to that. So does that mean that payday lenders, the traditional payday lenders, are doing less well now because these buy now, pay later products are in the market?
I can jump in on that one if you like. Not necessarily. There's some crossover in the user base, but there's also a lot of difference. So as far as we can tell, especially with the newness of buy now, pay later and its large uptake, seems to be enough of a separate market. So payday loan, those who are accessing payday loans tend to be a little bit older. They're more likely to be male. And one of the interesting things is that payday loans and buy now, pay later products also kind of interact with each other a bit. So someone might have a payday loan and prioritize paying that off because of the interest while putting other things on a buy now, pay later, and vice versa. A buy now, pay later might be the kind of start of a relationship with debt that then turns into a payday loan. There's some evidence of that. People who are missing their buy now, pay later repayments are also likely to be like missing loan repayments on a payday loan. So there's kind of an overlap in people kind of having trouble with both forms of credit, really.
And payday loans are adopting similar kind of marketing design as some of those other tools now as well. So they're shifting a lot towards apps and those kinds of things. And you see things like the gamification playing out among the payday loan sites now. So they look quite different than they perhaps did, even 10 years ago.
Just in our last minute or two as well, let's try to address the question that Barb put in the chat about class differences in the use of young people's use of the different forms of credit.
I can probably say something quickly on that. I mean, at the moment, we haven't probably had a chance to do a proper analysis of that. One of the reasons of that too is how difficult recruitment has been in this project, I think. So initially we were just kind of putting it out there, trying to get young people generally. And we got some responses, but they tended to be uni students, which I suppose is a relation to how we were putting these things out. So recently we've actually employed a recruiter, and they've been specified to get young people under a certain amount of earnings per year. So we're hoping to be able to kind of do a more kind of concrete analysis of that in the future, I suppose. But I don't know whether Daves and Julia have got anything to say about that from their own analysis.
Not really, but the thing is, it seems like all young people are using Afterpay, basically, or like many of them across the class spectrum. But if whether or not they're using it for different things is still kind of an open question. And yeah, as Steve said, we're still actually sampling. It's been quite hard to get people for this project.
Yeah. And there's obviously going to be class differences. We know there will be. It's just like, I suppose we're looking forward to being able to kind of draw those out. Other than the obvious, it's going to be harder for some to pay off than others. I think there's going to be other interesting things come out of the data than that as well.
For sure.
Particularly related to models.
Yeah, your comment about banks are trying to get into the buy now, pay later space. So, I mean, and now that you know to look for them, you'll see them everywhere. The Commonwealth Bank is now offering buy now, pay later services to its customers and stuff like that, because it's a massive exploding market. So the distinction between these kinds of services is going to start getting blurry.
Yeah, and banks are starting to partner with the existing buy now, pay later providers as well. So really, really interesting space.
And I think, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I wish we had more time, but yeah, thank you all for being involved and for contributing. It's been, I think, a great session. So thank you, everyone, and to our presenters in particular.
Thank you. And I know
for
there are
Social Sciences Week for organising.
There's lots of friends in the audience. So hello to all friends who
Hello.
who have their cameras off.
Thanks for coming.